The Thursday, August 30th meeting of the Water Quality Committee will come to order. Before we get into the agenda, point out we're joined by Selectman Doug Brown, Paul Dwyer from the Planning Board, Mary, Chairman of the Concom, and I believe you brought a staff person with you.
Yes, Brendan Lynch, our agent, and our Vice Chair, Jamie Mathis, is here also.
Chuck from DESE. The Enterprise guy here? Yep, okay.
And
League of Women Voters.
Peter.
And Peter Johnson-Staub, Assistant Town Manager. We are loaded with brass this morning. And for those of you who haven't been here, this is all being televised, so that anyone who wants to speak will have to speak into a microphone. And the one is up there that you can walk around with. So, there. We were requested by the town mothers and fathers to host what is going to be basically an informational meeting about the issues at Perch Pond. It falls into our jurisdiction in the sense that we're assigned by the town and the town meeting to deal with all the impaired estuaries in Falmouth, and there is no doubt that Perch Pond falls into that category. We had Matt Sleeper, who was sort of the moving party on behalf of the association out there. And Matt, you have a presentation for us to start us off?
I do, yeah.
we want to turn off a few lights, maybe?
Good morning. I'm assuming this is on. But,
Yes.
Yes.
There we go. That's great. Thank you. First and foremost, thank you for inviting me to attend. We got here because of letters to the selectmen, the conservation committee, the town manager, et cetera, on issues in the pond. Most recently, a very bad algae bloom that pretty much occupied 10 days through the course of the 4th of July weekend. So most of us were pretty much in peril during the course of that action, or during the course of that period of time. So I've put together a quick agenda on what we'd like to cover today. Cindy, if you could go ahead and bring it forward. So first and foremost, I'm Matt Sleeper. I was president of the now disbanded Perch Pond Preservation Incorporated. In 2012, I've been a resident of Perch Pond, it will be 10 years in October. In 2012, I noticed that the pond was really starting to deteriorate after 3 years of being there. And I took it upon myself to go door to door to all the neighbors and folks that lived around the pond to see if we could establish some type of group that could present and work together to find a solution for Perch Pond. What we could do to make it better, right? To protect the pond, the ecosystem, and that type of thing. In 2013, I spent time, and I'll go ahead here. And 2013 and 14, I went around fundraising amongst the groups and the folks around Perch Pond. We had 10 founding members. And in 2014, we brought our presentation to the selectmen. The selectmen encouraged us and actually applauded us for our citizen-driven effort to try to take care of the pond, to find a solution for the pond, and to work together with the community to try to drive that solution to ultimate execution. So during that process, and before we actually formally established in 2014, I met again with the selectmen, the Waterways Commission, the Harbor Master, Concom, and the then Assistant Town Manager, just to make sure that we had foundation for going forward as a group. We did, and in 2014 we formally established a nonprofit called Perch Pond Preservation Inc. That is now defunct. We actually closed its doors in December of 2017 due to kind of failure of our objective and the cost of continuing the organization ongoing. Next slide, please, Cindy. So I thought it would be worthwhile, because I've lived on Perch Pond and understand Perch Pond. I feel like I have a doctorate in Perch Pond these days, to understand the watershed and where everything comes from into Perch Pond, okay? So at its most western border, it actually goes from Nickerson Street to Route 28. And I'm going to come into a Google Earth overview so you can actually see this. Northern border is Route 28 and the adjacent northern runoff. Actually, there's a lot of runoff off 28 to the northern border that actually comes into the pond. The eastern border are multiple commercial areas, Aubuchon Plaza, all that commercial business over there, the Village Common Drive, Simply Self-Storage, St. Mark's to a certain, there's a runoff point where it goes into the Coonamessett River. And then the southern pond portion is Great Pond. And Cindy, if you go ahead and hit that link real quick. Gotta love technology, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Cindy, if you could pan out a little bit. Down on the right side, the minus,
Oh, I'm sorry.
or left side, yeah, there we go. So what I just discussed, and I have to walk away a little bit, does this disconnect?
It moves.
Yes, just pick it up.
Pull it right out.
There we go.
Wrapped around.
Careful, that's wrapped.
It's wrapped around.
Okay. That we can make work. So, Nickerson Street, well, actually, I'll start here, because okay, Cindy, go ahead, bring it
All right,
up
let
if
me
you
go
don't
up.
mind. Nickerson Street is just about right here. There's a little indentation of the pond, as you'll see right here, kind of at a salt marsh area, that captures the water and the runoff from all of these streets. It runs pretty much most of Mara Vista, depending on the grade, all the way down to 28. When I was talking about parts of north of 28, the hill actually grades down in this area. If you're familiar behind Falmouth Lumber and all that type of thing. It runs across, this is all Falmouth Lumber, Simply Self-Storage, there's the Aubuchon Plaza, and then St. Mark's, as you can see over here. There's a grade that falls, like I said, off the Coonamessett River, but it also comes down 28, actually 28 grades down into this section, all the way up and past J.R. Brody's. So it starts at about J.R. Brody's and flows down. So as you go north, clearly the southern aspect of that is Great Pond and the flushing of Great Pond. Okay. The other piece that's important to know, if you can come back to the head of the pond,
Sure.
is this is a wetlands area and a drainage point that I don't know if it's freshwater as well, but I know for a fact that that's the catch basin for all that runoff. All the stuff that comes off from Simply Self-Storage and all those areas that I talked about on that side of the pond, all comes down into this catch basin area here and then runs into the pond. Okay? So I just wanted to make sure everybody understood kind of the total effect and runoff of the pond. It's pretty substantial what it actually catches. And we'll dive into why that's important in a moment.
Do I just
So if you can just minimize and go back.
minimize it?
Yeah.
Or exit?
Yeah. Well, we can come back into it. So the other thing that we're talking about is there's a big plan in town to potentially widen Route 28, right? And it actually extends well past, beyond Mara Vista, all the way up to Oxbow Street. I have a little bit of a concern with that because you're creating more tar, which creates more runoff, which unfortunately, as we just discussed, drains into Perch Pond, at least if it were left as it is today. And granted, I'm sure the town has a plan, or the state has a plan for that. And then the other one comment I wanted to make is, in the almost 10 years I've been there, there have been no less than 3 funded studies to try to fix T-Ticket Path and the road coming down. Each were effectively killed or stalled because they thought it would increase runoff into the pond. So there's always been a concern about more runoff into the pond, to the point where we've lived with a road that looks a lot like something you'd see in Maine in the backwoods. So as you get down near the pond, it's full of ruts. They constantly fill it with back-ended tar. Okay, so any questions on that before we move forward, or do we feel comfortable?
Yeah, why don't you put on your whole presentation, then we get to the question part.
Certainly. Okay, next slide, please.
Sure, if I can get it to click.
So, we're studying your charges around the estuaries of the city, which I think there are 16 or 17 in total. I would profess to say that that Perch Pond is unique, that it is a very unique estuary compared to the other estuaries in this community. And the reason I say that is Perch Pond is a kettle pond, right? And I don't know how many of the other 16 or so are kettle ponds, but this is a kettle pond and probably one of the deepest in the community. So Cindy, if you could hit on that slide and then just pan into Perch Pond, please. Is it not working? Because you can go back up a slide if you want. Oh, back up. I can do it.
I can't get back to the arrow.
Let me
Do you have a keyboard?
Yeah,
Okay.
you know, like the bottom, it's not coming up again. Sorry about that.
I got it. I don't even know.
I know if it's
You know,
the
hit on the
mouse.
slide with your.
Yeah, because the pointer doesn't come up.
Yeah.
It's a person
See what I'm saying?
cursor.
You know, I'm going to go back up to this. We can do it from here. if need be.
The mouse isn't clicking.
Yeah, you know what? Excuse me one second. I'm going to back out of here and start fresh real quick.
Technical difficulty.
There we go.
Go to slide channel.
There we go.
There it is.
I'll just come from here again if you don't mind.
Strange.
Can you talk to it?
Who is that?
You just talk to it.
I can't, but I'd really like to bring it in.
Well, it
I
opens
have it
on the
here
laptop
for
and it
some
won't
reason.
come
Is it
up.
open, is it at the bottom?
I'm gonna hit this. Anyway, okay, I'm gonna talk to it real quick then. I can't seem to get it to actually detect the picture of the pond, which is up on my screen. So back to the conversation about the runoff and what I would consider the northern end of the pond. It's fairly shallow. It's pretty much a muck sand bed at the top. As you proceed down the pond, and there's kind of a slight picture of it over here, and then make your way up to the actual channel out of the pond. The depth varies from once you leave the kind of beginning of the pond on the north side to the first dock, varies from about 6 to 8 feet to 17 feet, and then making its way to the channel, which is a steep upgrade. At the base, right at the channel, there is a 4-foot wall that drops. And then you go into the channel, which at high tide can be around 4 feet, at low tide, inches, 6 to 8. So if we can go back down one slide, see if it works. I'll hand it to you.
I don't know how to get it to do what you want it to.
Yeah, not a problem. You gotta escape out of this. Then, we're back to where we began anyways. So that steep upgrade is right about here in the pond. And then we have this section in here, the channel today. So what happens is, and as you can see it here, when you get runoff into the pond, either from the north side or from Great Pond, the water either comes in carrying all of these nutrients or pollutants and ultimately stagnates in the pond. And then when water comes into the pond from Great Pond, it carries seaweed, algae, all that type of thing. It makes it up over that bed, comes into the pond, and ultimately degrades and falls apart in the bottom of the pond, which I think really is kind of the impetus for all of the things that are going on into the pond, candidly, that catch basin effect of it. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is from Woods Hole Group study. I did forward you that study. I'm not sure if it made it to the entire team or not. It was presented to Concom towards the end of our project. But you'll note the difference in the channel and the shoaling of the channel from 1994 to 2015. So in 1994, it was 133 feet wide. 2005, it's 65 feet wide. And today, it's about, well, 2015, it was about 55 feet. And I would suggest that it's somewhat close to that today. It has not changed dramatically, though the shoal has changed dramatically over time, just to the natural tidal effect in there. Okay, Cindy.
Oh, boy. I'm gonna get fired.
We did it. Good for us. The other thing I wanted to show you is the extremes in the tides. We have kind of a unique tidal basin there. It's different. You can look at the tides out on Falmouth Heights or at the end of Great Pond, and it's not at all like what we get up in this pond. And I think it's kind of the choke points and that type of thing that happen. But as I said, here's a kind of a summer picture. Here's a winter picture. Believe it or not, that picture is this picture. There's the channel right there. This is a huge soft shell clam bed on this side of the channel, right, which is fairly fertile, and I think refed a lot of the stuff that goes on out in Perch Pond. As you can see, here and here, there's literally inches at points in time in terms of flow into the pond, right? And then it goes from there to 4 feet. So you can have these extreme tides, as everybody knows, with the moon and that type of, it's tidal effect. So I just wanted to make sure you saw what the extreme effects of tide can be into this pond. Okay, Cindy?
This mouse. It's terrible.
So Perch Pond, again, is unique. And I think suffering the results of I can never pronounce this word properly, eutrophication and hypoxia, part of it's my nose right now, more than probably any pond of the 16 in Falmouth. Cindy, I'm going to have you go down into some of the pictures here real quick. So these are pictures taken on July 8th. This actually started on July 4th. These are the pictures taken from the pond of the algae bloom. As you can see, the color of the water is terrible. The smell of the water was terrible, to the point where people could not be in their yards. We actually left and went back to Boston during this period because we couldn't be in our front yard, right? And it lasted for almost an entire week before it finally broke up. And that's what sponsored ultimately my letters to the town. As you can see, the colors, it's substantial. So as you can see, and this is noted by pond watchers who studied the pond. There's significant degradation of oxygen levels in this pond, increased nitrogen levels, algae levels, resulting in scenarios like this, right? And the other thing that happened this year for the first time is we suffered our second algae bloom in August. We've never had two in a season that I know of. In the 10 years I've been here, we had our second one. And that's when I again emailed the selectmen and suggested that, we're having another bloom. Love to have someone come out here and take a peek at this. Okay? As a result of that, hypoxia continues to increase in the pond. These are actually pictures taken during the course of the July weekend after the event, right? Dead crabs. I actually forwarded these pictures to Concom and Selectmen and all that as part of my emails earlier. I mean, there's the blue crabs. Happened to be a dead duck for some reason. I don't know why. And then clearly the things that everybody's looking to protect, the soft-shell clams seem to be suffering. So these are actual pictures that were taken right in the pond. And candidly, if they're suffering, I can't imagine what it's doing to our kids and grandkids, right? They use that spit as a beach Families use it. If you spend time on Perch Pond, at the end of Perch Pond, at the end of T-Ticket Path is a beach, and there's a spit. The kids think it's a pirate island or something. They just love going to that spit. They're constantly in there and playing. And candidly, I see people fishing in there despite the fact that it's closed. Soft shelling and clamming. They're pulling clams out of it. And I'm like, I hope they're not making it to our commercial stores at this point in time. But again, they're in there, and hopefully they're for personal use. As you can see, these headlines have been caught up not only in Falmouth, but the first one was from the New York Times. People are hearing about this, not only here in Falmouth and on the Cape and in Boston and with the DEP. They're seeing it in the New York Times. What's that present to kind of people looking to come here and visit? What's that do to the commercial side of the business, right? What happens to our restaurants and hotels and that type of thing, right? And what happens to the shellfish down the road, candidly, if this stuff continues to persist? Cindy? So there's a lot of potential solutions. Well, not really a lot of potential solutions, candidly, but there are potential solutions. One of which is clearly figuring out the whole roadway thing and drainage and that type of thing. What do we do with the runoff that's coming off 28? Do we put catch basins in? I am not a civil engineer. I don't profess to be. But what do we do to do a better job at catching that water before it actually makes it into the ponds, right? And I know it's a low area, so I don't know what you do. You can make them so big, but they fill with sand, right? So unless you're constantly digging them out, it's a challenge. The sewer line extension, Cindy, why don't you go to that picture real quick, if you don't mind. So the recent Mara Vista Little Pond sewer extension made its way all the way from the head of the pond all the way down through just about T-Ticket Path School. But it totally, negated anything to do with Nickerson Street or anything to do with our pond, right? So they're talking about an extension of that sewer line, eventually. I would suggest, I'm not sure how much time we have, but again, eventually they'll get there. But I would suggest that that's only part of the problem. If we kind of go back to the whole drainage issue and the runoff issue, no matter what we do, you're still going to have all that flowing into the pond, right? From all these other areas. And we're not necessarily controlling all those other areas. They may not be on the sewer line. The other thing is, and I witnessed this in a house that was built next to me, is that even if you link the homes to the sewer, the existing cesspools aren't removed. They're sitting there still.
No, that's not right.
So you're saying I'm not correct, or?
Part of being hooked to the sewer is that the existing septic system.
So in this case, great, because that will have to happen. The new homes that have been built in my town, or on my point, the existing septic systems sit there still. They put new septic systems away from the water, but the ones that were there previous, 99 T-Ticket Path as an example, the existing septic system still sits in the water on the front, the water side of the house, was there for 50 or 60 years and continues to leach into the pond. And you can smell it at times.
Right, well, let's not get stuck here. Keep going.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cindy.
I'm trying. Okay.
Oh, went the wrong way. There we go. Now it's going
Oh my
backwards.
gosh.
Yeah, I'll get it. Let me
Nope,
go ahead
I
and get
have it.
for him. Nope, there we
I
go.
have it. Sorry, people.
No, it's
No,
going.
that's fine.
There we go. Yep.
One more.
Keep going. Okay, great.
Okay.
So, as part of the extensive presentations to the Concom, we had to do several different studies. Two of the ones that I thought were most poignant were the ones I forwarded to this committee, were the one from Don Anderson and the Woods Hole Group. So we'll get to that catchphrase in a second. But one of the things that was suggested during kind of our presentation was, let's dredge it to help it flush properly. And then we offered Perch Pond Preservation, Inc. to co-manage that solution with the town, the DEP, et cetera, so that we could make sure that it was sustainable, that it sustained. And granted, that may and would likely require continued dredging, right? Because the ocean moves, the bottoms move. Also, the plan of dredging supports the total ecosystem. It doesn't support one species, it supports the total ecosystem. And I would suggest that it protects and only enhances that major clam bed that I showed you that's within Perch Pond. Provides a richer shellfish habitat. And then the other comment, and we didn't really get into this during the Concom, but I've thought about it deeply over time, is that no matter if you dredge the thing to 3 or 4 feet mean low tide that we were talking about in our original plan, unless you meet kind of the equal point of where the channel ends on the Great Pond side, it doesn't mitigate the Kettle Pond effect. You continue to keep nutrients stuck in that pond. Cindy? So these are some quotes, and I'm not going to bore you with the quotes because you actually have these studies. So again, both of these came out very much in favor of supporting the ecosystem by dredging. Clearly, dredging is part of the solution, and all the other parts are also part of the solution. Woods Hole Group, who the town has used significantly in their dredging plans, was hired to do a study on our pond. It's very extensive. I hope you take time to look at it. It really is fairly telling about the pond and the ecosystem. I thought it was very profound. Anyway, Cindy, next. So in the end, the dredging and the mitigation that we might do with the sewage extension and new drainage techniques and things like that only serves to protect not only the feeder bed within Perch Pond, but really enhances and hopefully increases the ability to harvest more out of not only down the road inside of Perch Pond a little, but outside in Great Pond, which is incredibly fertile ground for all types of substantially soft shell and little necks and quahogs. And then lastly, and back to kind of that total ecosystem thing, it's really about the health of the pond and the health of the estuaries and the citizens that enjoy the recreation and the ponds and that type of thing. And in the end, when we're forced out of our homes because this stuff exists, I find it unfair because my tax base on property has not gone down. It continues to rise. And then, over time, things start to change, right? I mean, a clean pond promotes all the things that everybody's founded on and everything that we're working towards, right? So in the end, we're not trying to promote hurting a species. We're here to promote enhancing an ecosystem and ultimately helping all species. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Chuck, you have 2 slides, I'm told, purely informational.
You have no, I didn't know if they had questions. So
Sure, no, sorry. If you want to, what's your pleasure? You want to get the question answered? Why don't we get your piece in here first? So we'll have all the slides done.
Hello, my name is Chuck Martinson. I'm the Shellfish Constable and Deputy Director of Marine and Environment for the town of Falmouth. First of all, Mr. Sleeper, excellent presentation. That's wonderful information to get out there. And I think what I'd like to do is just maybe add a little additional factual information kind of to the discussion, if I could. Hopefully to kind of even bolster any future solutions that we might be able to look for. The first thing, I just want to give a little history, only back to 2004, but certainly the history goes much further than that. Probably goes back to the actual naming of the pond. It was named Perch Pond for a reason. It had perch in it at one point, which are predominantly freshwater fish. They certainly do travel into salt water from time to time, but by definition, perch are freshwater fish. And there's a long time between it being named in 2004, and there's all types of different things that have happened in evolving ecosystems that have kind of taken place over that time frame. But I'm going to use 2004 kind of as my back reference point, just because that's when we saw a lot of major things actually happen on the pond. In 2000, I believe 2002 or 2003, Paul Montague, our former shellfish constable, spoke with the Division of Marine Fisheries and basically pleaded with them to be able to allow the town to go in there and actually do some dredging for water quality purposes. Now, the water quality purposes that we were looking for initially were to open shell fishing in the area seasonally, okay? This area right now is prohibited for the taking of shellfish, which is right across, the line goes across here. By the way, if anyone sees anyone shellfishing in there, I appreciate a call earlier than today, if I could. That'd be awesome. That being said, for the time prior to that, this area was closed. This was prohibited from shellfishing. And what Paul's goal was to go ahead and dredge this area. And by dredging that, kind of common sense would lead you to believe that when that was dredged, you'd have better tidal exchange. And what would ultimately happen would be we would increase the amount of shell fishing that would be allowed in the area, and it would increase the amount of resource available for harvest and all sorts of things. So in and about 2003, 2004, this dredging took place there, okay? Fast forward about 2 years, and you'll see, I want you to look at the shoreline in 2004 and what's going on there. You had some salt marsh area, you had areas that were otherwise, certainly they had disruption coming from the land side, but not from the actual sides of the pond via docks or other types of activities that were going on in there. I want you to fast forward 2 years ahead and look at what happened to the pond. You'll see that there's a significant amount of docks that appeared, and then if you look at the last photo, which was from 2 years after that, in July of 2008, you'll see, I believe it's around 14 or 16 docks that appeared in there. And those appeared in a matter of 4 years. Really, the majority in the matter of 2 years. So I think it's also important to explain why that happened. I mean, if I have a deep water access to my pond and I put a dock in there, it's certainly worth a lot more money to have a dock behind your house. What I won't speak to is I don't know who's left there from that initial dredging, but I do know that there were a number of house sales after that took place. All right, so what's the result of this dredging? Where did we kind of end up after this? So initially we had a line which came up to about here, and it was open seasonally to the taking of shellfish. It was open only for 2 or 3 months in the winter. We lost that line within 2 years. So now, and you kind of want to know, why did that happen? How did that happen? Well, it probably happened for a couple different reasons, but the bottom line is that the dredging that we did there was not significant enough for any significant amount of time to keep that place open to the taking of shellfish. I think it's important to make a distinction, though, between what our levels are for the harvest of shellfish and what the other levels are to maybe deal with certain things like nitrogen issues in the water. We have certainly algae blooms, low DO events. They're all different numbers, but the number that we were using and the reason why we initially supported this project was for shellfish. That was the purpose. And our intended goals were not met whatsoever there. If we could jump to the other slide, I'd like to cover that if we could. What I would like to kind of also discuss is I think what your presentation of what's going on in the pond, I would agree with the majority of that. I think that's pretty accurate. But what I think is important, and it's really for informational purposes, is that if we are going to look for a long-term solution here, what we need to do is we need to get off the treadmill, okay? What we're doing now is the same thing that we've been doing for decades now. What happens? It fills in. We go over there, we dredge it out. What happens when we dredge it out? We put all the shell up on the beach, all the shell up on and sand up on the beach. the wind comes down. But what I wanted to do, I don't think we've seen this yet, is we haven't seen a visual of actually what's happening. And this was no more evident, in my opinion, than this last winter. We had three major storms in like 3 or 4 weeks. The majority of those storms came out of the Northeast. And what's going on here is that you've got, you'll have sometimes a tidal surge. Either way, you'll have waves and wind lapping the waves up along that shoreline, on that western shoreline. What happens is all the energy goes up and it reaches up and it grabs that sand down, okay? And if you walk along there, what you'll do is you'll see that bank has just continued to erode. There was a project over on that side where a significant amount of money was spent this last year, and before the permit was even closed out, the staircase was gone, right? So it's not working. I mean, I think it's pretty indisputable. That's just not working. So the first thing that happens are those storm events. And the prevailing wind is not that direction. That's generally the storm wind direction. So it pulls that sand down and off the bank, and what it does is it puts us on the treadmill. And then what happens is we have prevailing southwest winds. And these southwest winds are our common winds that we have in Falmouth. And what that does is it works away, and it works that sand down the beach, okay? And it keeps things moving further to the north. What I would suggest, part of a solution, if we need to look at a solution in the future, would be is if that was addressed, I think what's important here, though, is to also address this down here, okay? And there's a few different possibilities to look at down there: floating wetlands, bank stabilization. The bank stabilization has been difficult. It has not been successful. But I guess the point of me bringing this up is that I just wanted to kind of put out there that this is the cause, that's the effect, okay? So I don't want to forget this piece right here if we do address that piece. I don't know if you want to take questions or if you have anything, or wait till the end.
My name's
Let me just run this through the chairman if I could, just because he's controlling this, so I just want to make sure.
take her question, but I think the premise here would be the committee would get a shot at both of you, and then with the public. But go ahead, you're right here.
Well, no, the question I had is what would the suggestion be? Because we've seen the development of all of that area. What would because we are concerned about that. We saw that sand putting there. We're like, great, it's going to all wash into Perch Pond.
Yep.
So what would the suggestion be to help that whole area to stop from eroding?
Yes, that's just a question. I don't know that anybody has the answer.
Sure.
It's a very big question. This town's been looking at it for quite a while.
Right. The first thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to stand up here and first of all tell you biologically what's going on and act like I'm the expert. Because that I am kind of an expert on. But I don't want to get up here and also say, you know what, I'm going to be a geologist right now, and I'm going to tell you how to fix that problem, okay? And then I'm going to tell you, so my credibility at that point, if I told you exactly what would work, would be somewhat stretched. What I will say is there are options out there that are being explored. To what degree they're successful or not successful, there needs to be some exploration of that. The other part to it is that as we have sea level rise and we have more storms, that's likely going to be accelerated. And I don't necessarily think that that's an issue that's necessarily unique to this area. I mean, that's kind of an issue that's happening throughout Cape Cod and throughout, the eastern seaboard and to a larger point, other areas. So floating wetlands are one option. There's a number of different options that can be looked at.
Because even the mouth of Great Bay filled in.
Correct.
They had to come dredge it.
Okay, questions and comments from the committee?
I'd like to ask about the runoff. Mike, have you seen significant runoff into Perch Pond or Great Pond?
So, yes, during large storms.
Sheet flow across the surface.
Actually, there are times that in the bigger storms where it actually floods the road and comes straight through. There's no.
Are you talking
it's impassable, right?
Yeah,
Hence,
okay.
it's already wet in there to begin with, hence
Right,
all the
sure.
potholes. But yeah, all that runoff just floods over the road on the big storms, the big rainstorms. And then
Okay.
just up above, as you come up the grade,
Yeah,
there's a lady that lives on the left and another one on the right, and there's literally a pond that establishes.
right.
And the town wouldn't fix it because of the runoff, but the landowner, as I would have done, created a path for the water to drain down to the pond. Because they can't even use their driveway.
Right. If you have a chance, in the future, any of your neighbors could get out and take pictures of that, it would really help us.
Count on it.
Because last fall, after a really heavy downpour, I walked the western shore of Great Pond and
Yeah.
Perch Pond, and I couldn't see any indication of overflow from the catch basins. You know, many of those roads have pretty well-developed catch basins, and there were lots of what had been dry leaves, that fall's leaves, and I couldn't see any indication
Right.
of surface movement of the leaves or anything
Yeah.
else.
I can show you
T-ticket
flow
path-
out of the pond after a storm. I mean, it's the big rainstorms, so you get that 3, 4, 5 inches of rain in a short period of time that tends to flood that area, and I can take pictures. It's that backwater area I talked about up in the
Yeah.
northern part on the right.
Great.
That all floods and has flooded in 10 years, probably
Yeah.
10 times. So.
Sure. Matt?
One other comment on the proposal that we had put forth for dredging to kind of answer to Chuck's note on the sand washing back in. We had actually worked with the beach committee and DPW to actually not put the sand back onto the beach, but to haul it off to the beach disposal area for reuse on Falmouth Town beaches. So just so you know that.
Okay. Yeah, why don't we get Doug in here first? He's our boss.
Hey, Doug Brown, I just wanted to comment about the question on the runoff. As a member of the Falmouth Water Stewards, we're always kind of keeping track of that stuff, and I've actually taken a lot of photographs and forwarded to Peter McConerty
Okay,
with the
good.
concern over the years, and he actually has some sort of a design for a swale inside a T-ticket path, but it's yet to be implemented.
Right, yeah, I think T-ticket path is definitely the sore point there. As you know, last fall, I went and took a bunch of pictures and tried to figure out that situation, and that's an unusual situation, but it doesn't seem to be an issue for the entire western side of the estuary. The catch basins there seem to be doing a pretty good job. I couldn't see any evidence of problems with those, but yeah, the T-ticket path is definitely an issue. Yeah.
Matt?
So the USGS has been monitoring groundwater levels in our area for the last 42 years on a monthly basis. And I just pulled up the most recent data, and this past March, April, May, the groundwater levels were at their highest point in the last 42 years since they started collecting data in our area. So surface runoff is one thing, but let's not forget,
Yep.
you know, when groundwater levels are high, groundwater is loaded with nitrogen, groundwater inputs to these water bodies is going to be high as well. So.
Ron?
Oh, thanks, Eric. Yes, I think that what's interesting about the surface water studies that have been done, the Massachusetts Estuaries Project has done a lot of research on this and has actually done its best to model and quantify the contribution. And if you look at the Great Pond report, basically what you'll find, they don't divide it into the Perch Pond so much as the whole Great Pond system, but there's about 35,000 kilograms of nitrogen that come into or come toward the system, and about 25,000 actually enter the system. And of that, the contribution to the 35,000 is about 5,000 kilograms from surface water, so it's like 15 to 20%. Now, what Matt just mentioned is that the groundwater flow in from the watershed goes actually up to Joint Base Cape Cod. Yeah. And it goes from like Spectacle Pond over to Little Jenkins Pond. I mean, it's a wide swath that comes down, and a good part of it actually does go through Perch Pond. So you've got a large, a groundwater flow, which is why there's been a lot of focus on wastewater discharge, more so than surface water, because probably 15 to 20%, it's significant, and then it's like 15 to 20% of the total coming down from the watershed into the Great Pond system. So I think that addressing that, the emphasis has been on going over the big piece of it, which is the wastewater, which is about over 20,000 kilograms. Okay, so that's about 4 times what's coming on surface. But it is it's just the nature to look at it in a comprehensive way and look at the most strategic way to deal with it. And what Matt just mentioned about this year in particular, a lot more flow might have come in. And there is not an instant effect. There's a delay. And that may be that what you were seeing in July, and then maybe a secondary input point later in August or whatever, or earlier this month. So just to put it into a range. But I think that that this is, all of these things contribute, and it's important to understand and to see the relevance of each part. But this was a great presentation and an initiative.
So I actually can provide you a report directly on Great Pond. It's Mass DEP. I actually have it saved on my hard drive. I'll send it to Eric and he can distribute it.
Right, I think that we have the same one we're referring to.
Yeah, it's sort of our Bible, actually.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
We spent a lot of time
It's the same one. Yeah.
working with that. Yeah, Virginia?
I thought you made an excellent presentation, and it laid out the many different factors that affect the health of Perch Pond and, by extension, Great Pond as well. Every pond is unique. We do have several other kettle hole ponds that are impaired in Falmouth, but the solution, to the degree there is a solution, is unique to each of the ponds. And so sewering is going to have to be part of the solution here. And just to reassure you, there is active planning for the area that is beyond the sewer area that you showed on your map. The town has a program of funding these large capital projects at times when the debt service falls off. So we basically have a little, we call it a window, in our debt payments that we can maintain levelly by issuing new debt for new projects. So both sides of Perch Pond, the T-Ticket Pass side and the rest of the Mara Vista Peninsula, are part of that. And those decisions are going to be made relatively soon, 2021, 2022, if the town is going to hit the next debt window on time. That's my first point. The second is that I think we do need a somewhat coordinated approach on the stormwater so that the community has a sense that it's on the radar screen and that we are working on it. Our members of our committee have met with the engineering department about specific projects that they're working on, and it was obvious that there were pieces of that puzzle. One has not yet been mentioned this morning, and that is the direct discharge by pipe from Route 28 right into Perch Pond. That's in addition to the sheet flow that you've mentioned. So there needs, I think, perhaps some coordination within the town departments as to which pieces are going to be done and when. And to some degree, it has to be hooked in with what's being planned for roads and when the sewer will go in as well. The third point has to do with Mother Nature and these storm events, which are going to erode the west side of Great Pond, and the prevailing southwest winds, which are always going to be there. So I hear I hear Chuck saying we don't want to get on this treadmill. To some degree, clearly just putting sand and soft things on the eroding banks hasn't worked. We haven't mentioned something that's a favorite of John Waterbury, and that is oyster reefs, so that you create more resistance, you might say, to waves as they're being propagated and before they hit these cliffs. So I'm just throwing that out as an idea. But in any case, you're still going to have some treadmill to some degree And so I think we will always need some dredging to some degree. The last was in 2001. I was amazed to hear you say that it's in inches when it's at low tide. And that's just an average low tide, 6 to 8 inches is what it is?
Well, those were extreme low tides.
Oh,
I
okay.
would say that the low tides, a general low tide, is about 12 inches.
Okay, about a foot,
Fairly impassable. I have a
Okay.
whale of
All right.
15, and I can
yeah.
get that.
So I do think that there has to be some exploration of periodic maintenance dredging. I am concerned about the proliferation of docks. I looked at this, no, it's not this map, but you did have one map that was of two, anyway, one of these, and counted the number of docks. So here we are in 2008, and I believe there are 14.
They're now 16, I just counted them.
And they're now 16. Thank you very much. But the real question is whether, if it is dredged to 4 feet, whether we have another proliferation, and that is of concern to me. Thank you.
Any comments? On your road runoff issue, if and when the state highway is upgraded, their policy now, and I think it applies to the town as well, they have to find a place for the road runoff that isn't into an estuary. Right now, it is into the estuary. It's a straight shot. They just gather it and send it right to you. That won't happen when the new highway project is done. They did one in West Falmouth a little while ago, and they spent a lot of money to make sure that not a drop of it got into a pond in the area. So that will be different.
Interesting to see how they pump it out, because it's such a depression.
There's one other thing that one of our neighbors brought
Could
up.
we turn the light back on?
The subdivision. One of our neighbors was talking about, is it Seabrook? What's the name of that?
Come on in,
That there's
Steve. Excuse me.
drainage.
Our latest member,
Oh, the latest.
daylight savings time isn't here yet, Steve.
No, something missignal here somehow.
It's all right.
And I don't know what significance this has, but you know the drainage, like the holes where the water's supposed to drain, they're all filled.
Oh,
Like
the
you-
catch
so when-
basins?
Catch basins, they're all filled, and it's my understanding that that's not public, that's private, that road's private. Somebody was talking about that the other day, I just wonder
Is
how many of those.
T-Ticket Path?
No, it was in Seabrook.
Seabrook Drive.
Seabrook Drive, when you come into
Okay, well,
T-Ticket.
that's true. Seabrook is,
Because we walk there all the time, and you can see, the storms we've had, they filled in with sand and all kinds of stuff. And, I walked through Falmouth Port, and they're an association, and I noticed that they have these trucks that come in and clean them out. So I don't know what significance that has, but I noticed that a lot of them are filled right to the top.
Thank you.
thank you. Are there any other people from the neighborhood who'd like to weigh in here? We're here for you. Okay, anybody else from the town bodies, elected or appointed? Selectman Brown.
Hi, Doug Brown again. I hope we can consider dredging. I don't know what the basis for the denial of the request for dredging was, but it seems like it's just so obvious that taking sand out of that channel, placing it where we're most vulnerable with erosion and we're losing the road, I'm no scientist, but it just seems like an obvious thing to do, so I hope it can be considered.
Okay, any other comments from the committee? Any other comments from anybody else?
Mary?
I could just
Mary?
briefly.
Yeah, microphone, please. Chairman of the Conservation Commission, for those who don't know.
Mary Schumacher, Chairman of the Concom. I was not chairman at the time, but I was on the quorum for this whole hearing. And just to explain briefly the basis for the denial, it was really, I would say, 2 main factors. One was simply procedurally, the submissions. We had 2 main rounds through a long continued hearing of 7 months long. Began on the premise of maintenance dredging for navigational purposes, and the submission just wasn't adequate. It didn't contain all the things that we required for those purposes. So they went back to the drawing board and submitted something on a water quality basis. There were similar issues there, but really the most important thing for the Concom was, we were not disputing that dredging would probably lead to an improvement in water quality. The problem we had was the likely and previously demonstrated effects on the shellfish themselves and the shellfish habitat, and the fact that history had demonstrated, at least in the most recent dredging, that the water quality benefits were going to be much shorter lived than the damage to the shellfish resource and the shellfish habitat. So it was not, that we opposed dredging flat out, but the balance of considerations in this case was not something we could support. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. All right.
I have a technical question for Chuck. The present closure in Perch Pond is due to bacterial levels?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Peter?
First of all, I just want to say thank you to the committee for hosting this and for your work generally on water quality. It's not an easy task. I look forward to doing what we can to working with the impacted community members on multiple fronts. It seems like it's going to take a lot of time, but there is momentum on sewering, and I can work with DPW to get more specific information about the runoff issues and stormwater improvements and what that timeline looks like for those elements. I'm less clear on the way forward on dredging. There's some dispute among the scientists as to what the benefit is, how long-lasting the benefit might be. It seems like the prior application certainly could have been improved upon procedurally, but what I don't know, and I'm not going to put Mary on the spot because I don't think it's an answerable question. If that application had been had all of the required studies and supporting evidence and documentation, could it have passed muster? And I think that we can work with the conservation staff and see if we can try to identify some forecasting of whether an investment of resources in going through the whole permitting process is likely to meet with a different outcome than it did the first time. But clearly it's not a simple matter. There's a big hurdle there. There's a substantial shellfish resource, and the question becomes: is there a feasible way to dredge it and have a plan that's going to satisfy the regulatory standards for how long that impact is going to be and what the relative benefit on the other side to water quality will be. So again, all I can say is, I think it's going to take some investment of resources, and some of that will be town staff time, and we can put some town staff time to that, just to handicap whether then more significant investment of resources is plausibly might succeed to support dredging.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think we've finished this agenda piece up. You're all welcome to stay and listen to us talk about black muck. And you're all welcome to leave.
You might lose interest in lunch.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, Ron knows.
Okay, those of you with good memories will remember a year or so ago, we authorized a small experiment in this very area, actually, right near Birch Pond, to determine
Right.
whether a certain way of hopefully reducing the layers of black muck would actually work in practice. And Eric Karplos was knee-deep in that project, and he's here to give us a report on that and where we go next.
Okay, so just a note from this presentation in the upper right-hand corner.
You need the microphone.
We've been talking about Birch Pond, which is on the northwest side. Now we're going to move over to the northeast side, coming into Great Pond, which is off of the shore of Falmouth Port. And as was noted, we did a demonstration project in 2016. I'm just going to switch presentations, but wanted to connect it to the larger map. So this is a look at the bathymetry in an area off Falmouth Port. Falmouth Port Condominium Complex is right in here, and we selected a region where we knew there was soft bottom, and you can see, probably not the numbers, this is a 4 right here that shows you that that's about 4 feet deep. Everything lighter than that is shallower. Everything darker than that is deeper at low tide. And in this experimental area, some sediment cores were taken, and also at a control site further down, there were some sediment cores taken. And anyone who's familiar with the area knows that there's a bunch of smelly black muck on the bottom there. And that is indicated in a number of ways, but you can see when you look at the cores by the presence of carbon in the sediments that carbon usually came in from algae blooms that died and then went to the bottom. And so here's a couple of cores that were taken from different sites in the experimental area. And you can see in some cases there's kind of a low carbon composition that drops off within a few centimeters of the surface, which means the muck's not very deep. But in other places the muck goes fairly deep. And then in the control area, somewhat surprisingly, we found that the carbon composition was fairly steady and then increased, suggesting that maybe there's a peat bog down here somewhere that we didn't know about. So in any case, it's quite likely that several centimeters of this black material that's on the bottom now is the accumulation of stuff that isn't being somehow metabolized by whatever's happening on the bottom. This is not an uncommon problem in estuaries that have been eutrophied. And so one of the supposed approaches to resolving the situation is to get oxygen down there to start a process that can metabolize the organic matter that's down there. Actually, Chuck, if you could just hit the right arrow on the cursor, that might be a little easier. So we had been working with a company that had done aeration in some freshwater ponds, and they were very optimistic that it could help deliver oxygen to the bottom. The aeration itself, the little bubbles aren't necessarily the source of the oxygen, but rather they create a mass transport of surface water down to the bottom. And the presence of oxygen at the interface between the water and the muck is the place where you hopefully get that surface water so it can begin metabolizing things. And you can see this is a series of profiles that were taken by using an experimental sonde and descending it at different levels and making a measurement of the dissolved oxygen concentration. And this is from 6 a.m. in the morning. You can see there's about maybe 60% oxygen saturation early in the morning near the surface, but down at the bottom, there's hardly any oxygen at all. And that's why the muck just sits there, essentially. So the idea was to try to use a diffuser like this to create a flux of bubbles, and that the bubbles would come up and force the surface waters to come down, because when you're sending things up, there has to be something behind it. And so we laid out this field on the recommendation of the manufacturer of these systems, and then we made some measurements. We had a sonde in the middle. We went out and made a couple measurements profiling from a boat. And if you hit one more slide. This is an example of what we found at different distances away from those diffusers. This green line represents a measurement that was made essentially right on top of the diffuser. And you can see that there's been actually a disruption of the salinity gradient where the surface water looks kind of like the bottom water. But these two other locations at only 1 meter away or 3 meters away, about 10 feet away, have really not been disrupted. There's a freshwater inlet to the north of Falmouth Port that comes down and delivers fresh water on the surface. It's a different density from the salt water that's in the estuary already, so it sort of sits on top. And so that oxygenated water that's on the surface doesn't really want to go down, and the diffusers didn't seem to encourage it to move very much. There was a little bit of motion, but not very much. I have just, for contrast, because we're going to see it on the next slide over here, some experimental results. This was a thesis that was done by Jeffrey Church and overseen by Eric Adams at MIT, using turbulent jets to create a flow of water, to basically destratify the water so that you can have the surface water come down to the bottom. And so this is density here, which is somewhat like salinity. This is in a lab tank, and they looked at using the turbulent jets to disrupt the stratification in a scaled model. So everything was put in a small tank on the bench, but it was designed to look exactly the way it would if you deployed it in a real environment. And they showed that after about an hour of using these jets, they were able to get pretty good progress destratifying this system. If you hit one more slide. So this is kind of where we're at with the MUCK project. Having done some investigation to try to see if there are other aeration systems, it really seems like none of them are going to accomplish what's needed in terms of delivering the oxygen. The best way forward is likely to be getting the surface water down there using something that's able to deliver more energy more efficiently to the water. And we have down here another picture from the thesis showing how if you angle a jet in the right system, you can get a good result disrupting the salinity gradient. They're sort of showing how what you're trying to do is get it from something where everything's dense on the bottom to a much more shallow line, or even shifting the whole line so it's straight like the green line was in the previous slide. So you're trying to go from the blue line to the red line is what you're trying to do. So there's a possibility for deploying a system like this along here. One of the neat things about about Great Bay's northeastern estuary inlet is that the tide actually does cause the current to reverse during about half the day. So if you were to pick a line and treat the estuary right there, any mixing that you get to take place on that line will extend up and also down. And a lot of that's driven by the tidal flow, but then there's also some prevailing winds can affect things because it is so shallow. That effect doesn't exist in all estuaries, but it's one of the things we put out some flow meters, and we're able to demonstrate that that's a consistent effect. One of the things that seems very useful is to be able to monitor the gradient in these different locations as a function of time, and it's great if you have grad students you can send out in a boat. But for doing a consistent study, it's nice to have something automated. So we've done some development work on an automated profiling system that can be used in shallow water. And the plan is to run some tests later this year to just verify that we've got a working system if we were to do future work. The thing that's kind of looking most favorable right now if we were to pursue a project would be to use some sort of a rented system to verify that a turbulent jet can actually disrupt the flow. Mr. Adams has welcomed an invitation to design a system. He comes at a very steep rate, but would be willing to engage if it was desired to help us design a system. And our company was responsible for the deployment of the aeration system. We could easily help with the deployment of a test system here and see if there was something promising to pursue. I think it's important to note that regardless of what you do, the impact on the bottom sediments is years down the road. This is in some regards sort of like changing from a septic system to a sewage system or an IA system. There's a time delay between when you get the oxygen down there and when the carbon starts to be chewed up. And so whatever we do, if there is follow-up work, it needs to have a view that we won't see the results for probably, I would say 2 to 3 or 5 years down the road. You should get indicators early on that you're doing the mixing, but as to whether you're chewing up the muck effectively, that will take longer.
Yeah.
And that's all I have.
Okay.
Chuck has been an expert on black muck for a while. I wonder if you could kind of give us a bigger picture of the long-term gain even if it were successful, and the difficulties of permitting.
Sure. I think we'll use shellfish, I guess, as one of our, and eelgrass also is kind of one of our two, environmental bellwethers that we'll use. And I would, those upper reaches are, the bottom up there at this point is so inconsistent, and so it's almost like a mayonnaise.
Yeah.
You can't walk across it. There's nothing to it. From a biological perspective, you're getting turbidity off that mud as well, as boats and as the current and everything else passes past there. It causes a significant amount of turbidity, and really is one of the many reasons that eelgrass is kind of prohibited from growing in that area. The only real natural thing that can happen in some of these further up areas is if you have a large storm, and sometimes there's some sand that's shot up there that'll mix with that mud that will cause for a decent shellfish set. But outside of that, that's really the only shot that shellfish have kind of on their own. From a permitting perspective, I would probably have to defer to the conservation administrator for that. Certainly, testing equipment is a lot easier than a permanent fixed structure. But what I would say is that we certainly see de-icing equipment, which is placed on docks regularly, and that doesn't require permitting. And essentially, you're really not looking at anything too different from that than a de-icer almost. Some type of a jet system or a propulsion system, which would exchange the water and possibly have oxygen added to it, perhaps. So I don't know that it would be that much of an issue from a permitting perspective. So.
All right.
I was just going to mention, I don't know how these options compare to the solar bees that have been used in Mashpee in terms of stirring and that kind of thing, and whether that's been, this may be too shallow, I don't think it's probably not too shallow, but what a solar bee is, it's like a little floating unit on the pond, and it has a solar collector, a photovoltaic, and it drives a motor with a propeller down near the bottom, and it just sort of spins and creates an upwelling. By creating an upwelling, which is what you've been trying to do with the bubbles, it will probably drive oxygen down, which is kind of a standard process in some fish farming applications, but it may help. The other factor is that there was a review done in 1870 by, I think, the U.S. Fish Division for a nationwide assessment of oyster distribution in the United States. And there was a letter from someone by the name of Davis from Falmouth. So Davis is a name we know well, Falmouth. And in that study, in that letter, he wrote a letter to the organizer, or the lead person on the study, and in it he said that there were no oysters in Green Pond, okay, it's not Great Pond, but next door in Green Pond, because the bottom had a thick mat of blue muck in 1870. So some of these things have been here almost for quite a while.
When did it become black?
What? He called it blue muck. I don't know why. Maybe in Green Pond it looks blue.
I think I keep bringing this up, but one of the things which we often forget on Cape Cod is these coastal ponds are naturally filling in and turning into bogs as a natural process. And I just go back to my childhood in Wellfleet. I mean, the whole town of Wellfleet was moved in the 19th century when Bound Brook Harbor filled in naturally. And these estuaries are trying to become bogs naturally. And we're trying to impose stasis at this time, and we're really fighting a very strong natural process.
True enough. Yeah, Steve.
I had 4 questions, but Ron took one of them with a good question. Can we go back to one of your graphs, Eric? The one, the initial results. I just want to make sure I understood it.
The oxygen or
It was the salinity, I think. Yeah, I mean, in other words, the system made no difference at depth, right? Is the bottom line?
Yes. That's,
I mean, we
At
want to be
the-
clear,
in terms
it was
of-
unsuccessful at the bottom.
In terms of salinity, that's correct, and honestly, dissolved oxygen looked similar. This
Okay.
graph is just a little easier to see.
So we're looking for a better way. I just want to make
Yes,
sure that
absolutely.
that was clear.
Yep.
And from two things Chuck just mentioned, one is the de-icing sounds reasonable, but the purpose of that is to keep the surface water warm, right? So you don't form ice.
and moving.
Not warm, just moving.
Moving.
Right, but the functional purpose is to prevent boats from being crushed by the ice, which is on the surface, by keeping the surface water warm.
Typically, it's to keep the pilings from freezing into the water, because when the tide pushes frozen
Okay,
water up or down,
pilings,
it pulls the
boats.
pilings
Right,
out.
but it's a surface, it's to prevent ice at the surface, because
Yes,
that's where ice
by
is.
motion as well as
Right.
warmer water, but mostly motion.
And Chuck also mentioned the turbidity. If you do get sufficient mixing, aren't you also, it's going to be very hard to get sufficient mixing without bringing some of the mud up and increasing the turbidity? Or is that going to be not a problem?
So in the turbulent jet system, part of the idea is you are disrupting along a line. If you go a couple slides forward, there's likely to be some disruption right along this line, right here. But ideally, if you've mixed things at that point, then the current is going to push that disruption line down this way. And then when it reverses, it'll push it back up this way. And that will be much more, much lower energy water. So you're not going to get a lot of turbidity. So probably initially, when you turn the system on, you'll get some turbidity the first day. But then once that area clears out, it's likely that you'll just be mixing water, and that mixed water will slide along the bottom. That's what, I talked about this with Mr. Adams, that's what he was saying probably would happen. You'd have to try it.
For either one of you, if this were wildly successful, what would it look like in the end, and how long would it last?
If it was wildly successful, you'd chew up the carbon in the muck, and you'd have a suitable habitat for eelgrass, and fish would start spawning there.
And global warming, more CO2 to the atmosphere as you oxidize that
Well, how long-
refractory carbon in the muck.
Yes.
How long would it last? I mean,
You may end up running the treatment system indefinitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking.
well, that's what I'm wondering.
About, is it worth running in the wintertime when the bacteria are, chewing up the carbon at a much slower rate in terms of energy cost, benefit?
Yeah, it may not be, and actually part of the idea was to turn it off when the tide is slack, and only run it when you need it.
Well, a variation on that question is, how long would it take to get rid of the muck?
Years.
And actually, Matt,
100?
yeah.
I mean, who knows? If it was wildly successful, we'd expect, in a 5-year time frame, you might have a few centimeters starting to.
Out of a meter.
Well, if this thing
Well, 5 or 10 in some places. You'll start to, the deep piles are not going to go away first. The idea is you'd start to recover at the edges
Right.
first, and then it would work its way down. And there might be some synergies there. We
if this
just
thing
don't
is
know.
down there producing turbulence, how's the eelgrass going to start up?
The turbulence is along the line. So in this treatment strategy, you're just disrupting along a line
Okay.
right here. And so yes, that area will probably be a bare spot. But down here and up here, things will hopefully receive the oxygenated water at a slow, steady, calm rate.
Right. I have always viewed this as sort of a pilot project to find what would be the best type of equipment and setup in terms of proximity or distance of the generating source, rather than this is the specific spot at which we're going to try bring shellfish back, because it seems to me to be a somewhat unlikely spot for shellfish. But that if we figured out the technology for it, then you would go down to the more productive areas. I'm so glad you're nodding your head. Go down to the productive areas of a given pond and then work in that specific area. This is getting the bugs out and finding what would work best. There are going to be some ponds that were formerly marsh. And then as the sea level rose enough, they became a flooded coastal pond. So at some point, you're going to encounter, there's as much as 6 feet of peat in some of the marshes that I'm familiar with in Falmouth. So this isn't going to be useful in every place. But it is a way to work out what pieces of machinery might be more effective.
I think all that's true, and another thing to keep in mind is really, I think one question is, so if you do get the oxygen down there, what happens and how long does it take? Honestly, there are different strategies that may work in different places. We do have this tidal motion that doesn't present itself everywhere, and there are places like, I think many of us were at the presentation on Mill Pond, and they observed just when the temperature dropped for a few days in July, the pond flipped. So all the oxygenated water went to the bottom and started doing really good things to the water quality there. And so potentially, instead of using jets, maybe you could just put a refrigerated line near the surface and the water will sink. There may be other ways to do it.
Although the pond is a contained water body, whereas this is clearly tidal, and
right.
In this particular area, you've got 1 million gallons a day from the Coonamessett River coming by. So,
right. And so, whatever the strategy, and the solar bees, often have been successful in a deeper, more slower moving water body. One of the big things that works against you is you have these laminar flows that are with the stratified water. So as soon as you try to disrupt them, that water's gone.
Yeah.
And so you need to have a different strategy, probably more energy input than a solar bee could do.
We're at this location because of the interest and friendly cooperation of the Board of Directors of Falmouth Port. It isn't that we chose this as this is a good spot.
And they have been very supportive, allowing access to their facility. There's
yes, right.
Still equipment at the house there.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, can I?
Yeah, Steve.
Eric, could you respond to Ron's point about the solar bee? I mean, the solar bee is a commercial product.
Yep.
It's not paying somebody big bucks to do their research for them, as with this guy Adams, whoever he is. Do you see advantages or disadvantages of the turbulence versus the solar bee?
Honestly, when we initially looked at the solar bee, there were people saying that it was going to work, and there were the people out in Michigan saying their aeration was going to work. Everybody's system is going to work to solve this problem. I think if Solar Bee would like to bring one of their units out, we should do it. But we still need a profiler to monitor the effect. And then we're going to have to take cores and wait for 3 to 5 years. So honestly, whether it's Solar Bee or anything else, I think it's just important to get our brain around how this whole thing is going to unfold. Right. Do we want to engage in a project that has a 2, 3, 5 year time frame before we see the results? And who knows if it's going to result in a shellfish habitat at the end of the day. So I think I don't want to seem like we're promoting one technology over another. It's just in the stratified shallow systems, it seems that a lot of energy is going to be needed to disrupt that on a broad scale.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's the one thing we've learned from our current experiment. It wasn't enough. Any other comments or questions from anyone on the committee? Or anybody else? All right.
Can we have the lights again?
Yes, lights. Yes. Okay. Next item on the agenda is expenditure, authorizing an expenditure.
The coastal pond overlay.
Coastal pond overlay, never mind.
Okay. Coastal Pond Overlay District Map. Discussion and vote. This is before the committee in a formal sense. We've discussed it a number of times because the current planning, the current map that is on the town's website and has been approved by the planning board we found about a year ago was missing a number of watersheds. I want to thank the planning board for working with us on this, and that the purpose today is to take a vote to say that we are jointly, we, the Water Quality Management Committee, are jointly supporting an article that will be in the fall town meeting to update the Coastal Pond Overlay District maps. It will now include the ones that were missing. And it's been a very interesting 6 months, I guess, starting with doing the original research about how we originally got a coastal pond overlay map. The town of Falmouth was a leader in doing that, and it used the information at that time, which was 1988, to put the map onto our zoning, within our zoning regulations. So it used information at that time and the database that was available at that time to map these watersheds. It was updated in 2001 to add some watersheds, but we now know, based on the Massachusetts Estuaries Project, that there were a number of other estuaries that were impaired, and the planning board just didn't know about it in 2001. The second piece that has really improved this mapping is that the state hired the U.S. Geological Survey to do a very careful study of the water contours and the hydrology of the entire Upper Cape lens, so that everything was integrated, Bourne and Mashpee, because we share watersheds with both of them. So the entire Upper Cape was studied, and the mapping of the watersheds was then published in 2005. It was Don Walter and an associate named Whalen. And that became the basis of the research that was done by the MEP project, so that the entire database for the MEP project for the entire Cape, in fact, is based on USGS data and what they call the shape files, which are the electronic files that clearly define the boundaries of the watersheds. That was given to the Cape Cod Commission and shared by all the towns and by the MEP project. So I have a lot of confidence that the map that we will be voting, which is an update of the existing map, will serve us for many years to come, and it does accurately reflect the watersheds. The ones that will be now voted, there's a total, we've been saying 15. The total is actually 14, and the reason we got to 15 originally was that the Eel Pond watershed was studied separately, but it's really part of the Waquoit watershed in terms of classification. So we basically have 14 impaired watersheds, and this map was sent around to everybody. And so I'm making a motion that the Water Quality Management Committee vote to co-sponsor the article in the fall town meeting with the planning board that will update the coastal pond overlay maps.
And I'll second that motion.
Moved and seconded, discussion?
Were there any surprises or substantial changes, or is it just tweaks to the existing watershed?
They are tweaks. There are some changes in some watersheds. Great Pond watershed is slightly larger, Green Pond is slightly smaller. The main thing is that the gaps were filled in. The Falmouth Inner Harbor was missing. Quissit, which is what started all of this, was missing. And then these watersheds up here, Rand's Canal and Fiddler's Cove, were just not on the map. So there was there was a gap here. But basically, you're looking at substantially the same maps that you have seen from the MEP reports.
Right.
I'm just wondering, will this also be supporting the way the town looks at the accessory apartment bylaw kind of thing because of the
right
laying out the full plan?
Yes.
The full situation, rather. Yeah.
The accessory apartment discussion is what triggered us to notice that there was something missing. So clearly, if you are in a watershed that wasn't on the map, then you would say, yes, that's a major change. But it doesn't, the accessory apartment bylaw is being updated itself, and I think a wonderful job has been done on that, too. But it doesn't, at this point, change anything else. Okay.
I have a more technical question probably to Matt, because he's right close by here. Are there any consistent seasonal or longer multi-year term fluctuations in the boundaries based, say, on drought or input to the system?
Oh, that's
This
a good
assumes
question.
a steady state.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, in an ideal world, we would say, yeah.
I know in other places, for example, Greenland, where I've worked and tried to define watershed boundaries, it's a lot harder because it's data limited. We don't have the USGS there, but there's something called water piracy, where
Yeah.
during certain
That's
times of
what
the year,
just
you
exactly
have
what I'm
water
thinking.
flowing into one
Yep.
watershed, but here, I don't know if that would be a big issue here.
And it's pretty much all unconfined, too. It's, as you said, you use the term steady
You
state.
can't rebuild your accessory apartment every fall and then take it down in the spring.
Well,
For legal purposes.
I wasn't going to
fixed
go
boundaries.
quite that practical with it, but I was interested, as I said, from at least from a theoretical, speculative standpoint. I figure it's still dynamic. You say steady state, but
For modeling purposes, if you ask me about how they arrived at boundaries for this, they are assuming a steady state. The other point I would make is that usually, because so much of Falmouth discharges to some coastal pond or other, you have a 70% chance
Yes.
that if you're not in this watershed, you're in the one right next door. So it's neither here nor there.
when I was rolling over rocks last night, blowing this thing up and looking at the boundaries running down the middle of certain streets.
Yeah.
So if we have, because it could get pretty dicey. Somebody's house 150 feet away doesn't have to do something where someone else does. It's going to be, from a practical standpoint, it's going to be interesting. That's what I was
Right.
doing last night for a few minutes.
But you have to realize that that's always been there since 1988.
Right, yes, oh, I know. I'm
So
just,
the town GIS has an actual line,
Yep.
goes property by property.
I know.
So that challenge, and I agree, it is a challenge, has always been there.
Yeah, at some point you draw a line.
That's right.
That's what we've got.
That's right.
It's the same with floodplains, which are
Well,
clearly variable,
yeah,
right?
good point.
And you're either in one or you're not in one.
So what happens if your house is not in a watershed and your septic tank is?
Just a whole lot, not half a lot.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
It goes by property lines.
Okay.
Okay. So I made a motion, it was seconded.
Okay, let's vote this before any more foolish questions.
Well, briefly while we're on that, we didn't get a chance to raise the point before, but once a household upgrades to a Title V, there's no more flow through their cesspool. It's not going to be contributing because it's not any input into that cesspool. It's a point to make to some people. He said he was concerned.
No, there is. I mean, even when you pump a cesspool, fill it with sand, it has a plume that has a memory.
Right, it has a plume, but there's no input anymore into
You've
it.
eliminated the point source, you haven't eliminated the tail.
Right, that's
It
still
takes
there,
time
and it's
for
going to be
that
there
to
for a long
flush
time.
through. But if he's, when the new Title V was put in, they had to, I would presume.
Yes.
Be required, pump and fill,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, that should have been made clear to our neighbors there.
Yeah, he seemed to think it went on forever.
Yep.
All right,
You didn't call the vote.
moved and seconded. All in favor of updating, voting to support an article submitted by the planning board and ourselves to update the coastal pond overlay district map?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous. Now, Article 4, here, or Section 4. As you know, we got a grant a year or so ago from the county to install IA systems. And one of those IA systems that the coalition has been very keen on seeing happen is in the West Falmouth Fire Station. It's in the watershed, and it needs a new upgrade of its septic system. And the town actually voted money to do an upgrade of the septic system. At the time, they weren't thinking about IA systems, but they're thinking about it now, and they've agreed, actually, to put an IA system in there when they do that upgrade. The grant from the county covers the cost of the equipment, the box that actually goes in the ground. It does not cover the installation cost, and the town meeting vote didn't cover the installation cost because they weren't thinking about it. So there will be a cost. Nobody knows right now how much it is, but it certainly won't be more than $15,000. And so the DPW asked us to commit to funding that cost. And that's why we're taking this up.
I lost you somewhere along the way there. What did the town actually commit to paying for?
An upgraded Title V system at the West Falmouth Fire Station.
Okay.
But it had no IA element.
Okay, so this...
The premise here is, if we want to add an IA element, it'll cost some money.
This is the money that would be required to, over and above, to get the Cadillac IA system.
Right. The town appropriation covered the cost of a standard Title V system. The county money will cover the cost of the box that involves the IA.
Mm-hmm.
It does not cover the cost of the putting it in the ground.
Hmm.
And that's what we're being asked to commit to here.
So I'll make that motion that we recommended.
Okay.
I'll certainly second it. I think the more IAs that we can get into West Falmouth, the better, because it's clearly headed in that direction. We don't want a sewer West Falmouth, and ultimately we need IAs on every property.
Do we know what technology is proposed?
The Smith one.
Which technology?
The vineyard system.
Yeah, there's a model being tried out on the vineyard that they put half a dozen in the ground over there, and we'd like to put one in the ground over here.
And just because it's, oh, sorry. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so, Ron.
No, I was just wondering, so the system has been selected already?
The reason this one was selected is the coalition liked it, and the guy was willing to do it for $7,500, which was less than the others would have been.
Right, but the only question is it one that has been approved for general use by the state?
None of these have been
None.
approved for general use by
None
the state.
approvals.
They all require a...
Well, there are some, there's a list of how many
Yeah, but none of them that
doesn't.
get 10, which is the only thing we're interested in.
Now, the question is that if it's a test thing, they may have to, I mean, there's some that have proven certain, they've been tested over and over, George and everybody, they've tested them.
This is one that George has been working with.
Right, okay, but it isn't, if it's still in an experimental stage, they may have to replace it, is my point. Because if it doesn't, we're not putting in a proven technology as far as the EP is concerned. So it's sort of, I just think, why wouldn't they pick something that is sort of an off-the-shelf thing?
Well,
This is a pilot, this will be a pilot.
we're at pilot stage wherever you are.
Yeah, they're all pilots at this point.
I know, but even the, I just, it just seems it's using taxpayers' money, it's a little higher risk to take that approach versus something that has been certified.
But Ron, we don't have, there's not a system right now that will do what we'd like to see this one do, and I might add, to me, $15,000. It's not a lot of money to find out if these things work. This is the big stumbling block we're facing right now. We've got lots of projected different systems, but
you see that there's the general, those that have been approved for general use, there's some for provisional use, there's some for pilot use, and there's some for whatever, and it's sort of like, if the town is investing, you would think it would, it's another experiment that we're basically paying for, which isn't
Right.
just the...
That's what our budget's for.
It isn't just the installation cost, but it's also the capital cost that the county's paying for. So in the future, there may be a combination of those two things that would need to be invested to fix something that's experimental versus something that is proven.
Steve?
Maybe this question's been answered, but I'd like to hear what's special about this. I mean, why it comes out of the budget of this committee. Otherwise, it's just a finance committee decision to take some money from this pot and put it in the fire department's pot. I guess it's that that this particular one is a technology that's worth pushing along a little harder, but otherwise we're setting a precedent. I mean, we're going to need thousands of IA systems, and this is just one. And we're the research arm of the town government, so to speak. So I want to hear somebody tell me how this fits in that hole.
Okay.
I mean, this is a municipal system which has failed,
Right,
which we need to replace.
right.
And so this gives us an opportunity to use a technology which we think has a great deal of potential, to put it in and be able to test it in a site where we've got to do something to begin
Okay,
with.
all right.
The 15,000
It's
is
peanuts.
an outer limit.
It's an up to.
Yeah.
It's quite likely to be a lot less, because.
And we're leveraging all these other
Right.
contributions.
The budget already includes whatever it would cost to install a normal Title V system. So what we're being asked to fund is whatever additional cost it might be to supplement that Title V system with a IA system that.
And they're already on the property with their backhoe digging holes and so on. This is just a slightly bigger hole with an extra tank that's already being paid for, so.
And hooking it up, yeah.
So we should be careful how much of the cost is ascribed to this operation.
Fair enough. Matt?
So have you run out of volunteers in West Falmouth to install
No.
one of these IA systems?
No, they actually are oversubscribed.
So,
But this will be a municipal, at this point, this is on municipal property. and-
I understand, but
Okay.
this is one, you're using county grant funds, right, towards this. So it's one less house that you could do.
Right.
So my argument is, why not just get another house where the homeowner is going to pay this extra $15,000 to put a,
Well, and one reason the coalition has put forth is that a lot of the homeowners they deal with are sort of saying, what's the town doing? And they see a fire station as a failed system, and the town not putting an IA in. And meanwhile, they're going to these people saying, why don't you put an IA in? So
Do people live at this fire station? I
Yeah,
mean, is the
24 hours a
nitrogen?
day.
there's a fireman there 24 hours a day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, it seems, we're paying for symbolism here,
Well,
not
that's part of it.
necessarily nitrogen. It's two people
Well, two
versus a
people-
house that's got, four.
Two people who are awake
six
24
people.
hours a day, so
Yeah.
they're, we hope.
Drinking coffee.
Yeah.
Just to clarify on the point earlier about why not use a system that's already been approved for general use, I think that the reason is because if you did that, you would be guaranteeing that you're installing a system that cannot perform as well as you need it to.
Right, it
Right.
performs to 19 milligrams per liter.
Right.
And
So you're actually guaranteeing failure by doing that.
Yes, ultimately.
Yeah. All right, we've been moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Saying no.
Opposed.
Oh, was that an opposed or an abstain?
noes.
Two opposed?
Two opposed.
Okay.
Okay. Reports of members of the staff.
I'm still following up with the New Hampshire Stormwater people, and so far, no new report. There was the idea that a updated report was going to be issued in June, and so far, no word from them.
What was it about?
Stormwater management, best practices, and my new nickname is Stormy Waters. But I don't want any money from anyone yet.
Should we send you money?
Doug, you've got something to add?
I just wanted to report that we did have our first initial meeting with Mashpee and Sandwich and Barnstable representatives to discuss the Wacoit Bay watershed. And the Andrew Gottlieb from Mashpee was very interested to move forward as soon as possible because they've already started some implementations there. And they were hoping to get us to quickly sign an agreement to sign on to a permit. And Ray Jack attended with Julian Suso, and Ray gave some good insight toward the workings of the permit and was reluctant to commit. Of course, we weren't ready to commit anyway, but I mean, he pointed out strongly that it would be really counter to our planning to jump ahead of the pack and start committing to a permit in Wacoit Bay when our plan has all along been to move from west to east. But I just want to make you aware of that. That's something that they really hope to push. And Ray was very strongly opposed to it. I could have been convinced to try to do something. What I would like to see us do maybe is commit to some sort of aquaculture plan there. Maybe the aquaculture planning there could be pushed a little bit ahead, but not tied to a sewer permit. I'm not sure if that will satisfy Mr. Gottlieb's request, but that's sort of where we're at in the beginning stages. So as you give thought to aquaculture, maybe you could turn to that first if it's feasible. I know we're looking at Bourne's Pond first right now.
Right, can I finish? I thought there was an interim step that still needs to be done, and that is the agreement on what percent each of the towns shares of the Wacoit watershed. It is a very complicated watershed and very, very large, and it goes up into Sandwich. And so I think the three towns need to come to an agreement on, yes, by whatever the math and whoever does the figuring, is it done by an engineer and so on, so that there's clear agreement. Because not only do we need it, but it's my understanding, and this is from informal conversations with Sandwich selectmen and town manager over several years, Sandwich has a small amount.
Right.
Maybe it's 5%, something, anyway. They don't intend to do anything, but they would consider making a monetary payment.
Correct.
Okay, and so the stipulation of how we get to that dollar amount, when are those dollars transmitted to the other towns? Those things need to be worked out.
Right, absolutely. This was just our initial meeting.
Okay, yes. So I'm just saying, going from your initial meeting to, it's a little ambitious on Mr. Gottlieb's part that he would expect we're ready to sign a permit.
Maybe I misspoke. He didn't say, he just stated that was his objective.
Oh, sure.
Get us to move toward that permit as quickly as possible, because they're already implementing steps.
Okay. Richard York was their shellfish warden, and he was the one that strongly convinced his town, Mashpee, that shellfish was the way to go and the solution for lots of things. He's now no longer shellfish warden. There's a new warden. Her name is Ashley Fisher. He has moved up to be director of natural resources, but I'm waiting to see whether that changes the dynamics in Mashpee. And I just sort of bring that to your attention.
Okay.
I have
other reports. Ron?
Oh, thanks. Well, first of all, I don't know if since we haven't had a meeting in a while, that to announce that Doug and his cohorts have reappointed Steve and I to this committee for 3 more years.
Wow, really?
So we are, so we're very
Thank you.
for that privilege and distinguished honor. The second thing is I went to the part of the June 29th Buzzards Bay Falmouth meeting at the Academy on the West Falmouth Harbor. And part of the session I could be a part, I could attend, was actually your presentation, at least one of your presentations, Eric, about PRBs. I think that you were going to do it, Virginia, and you gave a very, very concise presentation, I must say, and about why we were doing it there. And what I was wondering is that you had mentioned that there were just 2 questions that came up. One was that you said the location that was selected in the areas there, that the PRB would have to be too deep, it has to be like 40 feet down, and that was not reasonable. And I didn't know if the well type things were the same kind of thing, because originally we looked at trenches and that was too expensive. But I just wondered if this well type of thing of putting emulsified vegetable oil, EVO, in the ground could work in a more cost-effective way with a deeper. That would be more costly, clearly, to go deeper, but still wouldn't be digging a trench for however long it would be.
Yeah,
So
the trench was beyond any excavator's possibility.
Yeah.
If you did the injection, you could say theoretically, it was doable. But the problem is the geology in that area. That is the moraine. And so you will find boulders all the way down.
know.
So you can't space it at reliable distances, number one. And then the second is, even if you do, because there's so many boulders, you can't predict that you will get even distribution. All of the modeling that we've seen for modeling and in the field, PRB applications, have always been in outwash plains and areas that are uniform, relatively uniform soils. So for another construction reason, it's not
Yeah.
practical.
The other problem was the plume you were going to be intercepting was the wastewater treatment plume.
Right.
Which, as we all know, is down to 3 now. So your long-term gain isn't very much, because presumably it's going to be
It's gonna
3
flush
at some point. So that was a problem.
That's
And
not-
and the point of a PRB was to learn how well it would work on intercepting
Right.
household wastewater
Right.
and not a treatment plant wastewater.
Well, yeah, I'm fully aware that, you just have to look at my yard about the boulders. I know exactly
Well,
what this
you know-
is,
you know what it
because,
is.
When we
It's-
put in the wind turbine, it was like, okay, let's roll the dice and see if we can do it.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
but that was, but it's, that's a good point that I don't think had been raised before, but it's a good, at least, I wasn't aware.
It's the reason.
So that was a good thing. The other thing in West Falmouth too is that because they reported at the meeting, it was in the Enterprise, that the nitrogen hasn't reached the level after, what is it now, 13
13 years.
years, when it should have been like 10 years ago, we should have been seeing something in the wells. So I wonder how much the build out in the area and the rest of the septic impact may be affecting. But that's, I thought about going and looking at the historic building permit thing and see just what's happened since 2005 or maybe even 2000. And just to see what the sequence and what the development is. But the other interesting thing you said, Eric, was that you didn't think that people in West Falmouth would accept it because they were basically pumping used French fried oil down in the ground. And I don't know, if West Falmouth won't take it, I don't know about Matt's project in East Falmouth. But he's going to be monitoring for this French fried oil
It was a problem
extract.
for the coalition in that this PRB was proposed for immediately adjacent to the harbor. And
Right.
sort of if anything went wrong and you found emulsion oil going into the harbor, they wouldn't want to be part of it.
Right.
That was the gist of my point.
Well, the other thing with Matt, with the project you proposed, I don't know what the status is now, hopefully it's moving along nicely, but it's down, it didn't go.
It didn't
Oh, it didn't go, okay. Well, anyway, you had monitoring of that in it, so it was part of it, was to check, to be
I know,
sure as a pilot.
now that there's the soybean tariffs, I think we could get a real deal on this.
I see,
So
okay.
the whole
all
cost
right.
of the project
Yeah, sorry
just
to
got a
hear
lot
that.
more
Yeah,
attractive.
I was hopeful for that one, but sorry to
We'll
hear
say
that.
in reference to that, I went to the Open Cape, or One Cape conference, and then they all tout enthusiastically different initiatives that they like to think they're supporting. They have not been supporting this particular kind of initiative now. We've applied twice, once by the committee and once by Matt, to put a PRB in a location that's been vetted ahead of time and has every reason to think it would work, and both times the funding has not been made available. So to the extent they keep it on their list of things they want to support, they haven't put the money in it yet, except for one experiment down Cape, which turned out to be not a winner. So-
And it was paid for by the town.
Yeah, okay, well, then they
So
paid for
the answer is
nothing.
zero.
So is there a report on that, what happened to that one?
Which
Where
one?
was it, in Orleans or
There's an
something?
interim report.
What?
There is an interim report, yes.
Oh, can we see, if you have it, could you send it to us? That'd be great.
Yeah.
Sure.
How much would it cost to have the town pay for that grant that you got tonight? That's the Shorewood Drive study.
It was the cost, the request for federal dollars was around $400,000. And there was a couple of hundred in cost share thrown in there.
Disappointing. Whenever you're finished with your reports, I was curious if there's any news on when we might see some action on remediation at Mill Pond.
Okay, any other?
The report, well, let's just answer the question.
Sure.
So we're waiting for the written report, it'll be in draft, from Brian House. He is supposed to get it to us by the end of September, that's what his contract says. And then we will review it carefully. I did talk to him about various kinds of remediation, and so there may be a section on suggested, and possibly some cost information. But until we get the document, can't say
Right.
for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. I have two things.
Sure.
The first is that we talked earlier about sewering the rest of Mara Vista, T-Ticket Path. Regardless of whether they're sewering there or whether Oyster Pond's flow gets added to the wastewater flow, there has to be a decision by the town on additional areas for discharge. The plant has the capacity to process the wastewater, but it has to get a more discharge capacity. And so in that vein, the town's engineers, GHD, have been looking at a range of discharge sites. And so one possibility is there are a couple of sites where there could be sand filter beds, and so it's a groundwater discharge. And so they are now doing what are called perk tests, but extended perk tests, of two sites. One is the Augusta parcel, which runs between Brick Hill Road and Route 28 and was purchased by the town for wastewater reasons. And the other is what's called the Allen parcel, which is on Carriage Shop Road. It's in the Great Pond watershed. Both of those are in the Great Pond watershed. And it's about a 12-acre site of a much larger area that is conservation. So there will be drilling rigs out there to put in monitoring wells, and then there will be a small area that is cleared, and water will be brought from a hydrant. And so it's measured, and then over time they see what the percolation rate is. This announcement was given to the selectmen, but I never saw it in the enterprise, so I just thought we should mention it here.
So Virginia, the idea is when it's brought online, the water would just be piped from Blacksmith Shop Road.
To the
Probably
discharge.
gravity.
Yes.
So it would be easy to do, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
But it's in the Great Pond watershed.
They're both.
Yeah, they're both in the,
Both in the
but
Great
presumably
Pond.
that it'd be at the 3 parts
Yes,
per
absolutely.
million, so,
Absolutely,
So,
yeah.
But you'd have to compensate for that.
right, that would be
Absolutely.
another.
Yeah.
yeah, good.
All right. And then the other is the Oyster Pond meeting, which I was not able to attend, but apparently was very successful. And I read the article in the Enterprise, and I agreed with everything until we got to the last paragraph, where Mr. Leonard, the engineer, made a comment about the funding, ending with the next debt window isn't until 2025, with the implication that nothing would really happen until 2025. And I didn't want to leave that perception, because 2025 is when all the decisions have been made, the bonds have been voted, and shovel goes in the ground, and we start making payments. So Oyster Pond, in terms of being a project, if it were to be done under the bonding window, those decisions are made in 2021, 2022, sets us on that path.
Virginia,
So
could I
it's a lot
suggest,
sooner.
as a point of clarification, maybe the committee just recommend that you send a letter to the Enterprise?
Well, here's what I thought, no.
Wait, I want to clarify what you're saying. I think I heard you say that, of course, the decisions have to be made before the work starts in 2025.
Right.
But you're not saying that the work would start before 2025, or are you?
No.
Although Eric has pointed out that if you did IAs, in principle, you could start sooner.
I
If you had
agree.
another source of the money to subsidize people.
Yes,
So it's-
I completely agree with all of that.
Yeah, it is. I thought it was well done.
I thought it might be useful to the committee at our next meeting on September 6th that we go over two things. One is what we need to accomplish between now and December 2019, and more or less what needs to happen when to make the report to the state. This report has to have a public meeting, public vetting, and it goes to the selectmen, and ultimately the selectmen will actually vote the document, so it's a fairly significant piece of work from the towns. And the second is then also to look out to 2025, because there are various things the town needs to file with the state if we're going to get a 0% loan.
Absolutely.
So we need to have a, let's call it a master calendar, from now to 2025. And I thought it might be good to sort of go through that next week.
Perfect.
Right.
Eric?
Yeah, Steve.
This is a totally different subject, and it's about one thing I know practically nothing about, and one thing I know only a little bit about. But since there's somebody here from the selectmen and somebody from the planning board, I wanted to at least bring it up. This is just from reading in the Enterprise. Apparently, there's going to be substantial water main work as far as the Oxbow.
Yes.
They're working
Disrupting Route 28.
Correct.
I've heard from Eric and others that there's, at some point in the perhaps distant future, perhaps too distant future, sewering on at least one or more far eastern estuaries. That suggests to a non-civil engineer that you might want to dig up Route 28 only once.
They never do.
And the rest is beyond me. It's up to you guys and Ray, Jack, and the calendar and money. But the idea is pretty obvious, right?
Water main, gas main,
Ray Jack has, that thought has occurred to him.
Surprising.
Yeah.
And Ray spoke with me and Julian recently about that. He's already got us in line for TIPS funding for over $10 million to help with the water line and the repaving of that. And he's anxious about moving that forward, but I'm a little more anxious about moving forward without things like, personally, I'd like to see the utility lines underground as well. That's a very expensive proposition, but Mr. Jack is working on coming up with some cost estimates, and I'm personally advocating for just ripping up one side of the road for now for the water line and leaving it just temporarily patched, even if it's for a couple of years, until we can decide if it's feasible to do the utilities. And at the same time, we might consider whether or not the planning shows that we're going to have sewer lines going down that road, or whether they'll go directly down Brick Kiln, or, we don't know exactly where they're going to go yet, but we should consider whether or not we want to get involved with that.
The Enterprise is going to be sorry they left early.
Yes.
Just in answer to your suggestion, like 20 years of experience in the legislative world has taught me 4 words: never complain and never explain, especially when you're dealing with a newspaper story that has an awful lot of detail in it. The guy did a pretty good job.
Yes.
A small detail at the tail end wasn't totally
No, I wasn't
filled in, but you don't complain about it.
No, I was not at all going to suggest as a complaint. I was suggesting only as clarification.
The number of people who are attuned to this issue right now are probably, the majority of them are sitting in this room.
Right.
I don't think the rest of the town is
Sure.
ready to be
Fine.
corrected on that kind of a detail yet. We'll have plenty of opportunity to spell the story out in more detail in the years ahead. But this was a pretty good story for a guy who has not covered us.
Yeah, no, it was great. I thought it was very well done.
Very good job.
I give him credit.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the prior minutes meetings. We have 3 of them. One was a real meeting, and 2 of them were meetings where we were attending other presentations.
I move that they all be approved as written.
Second.
Seconded.
Discussion? Discussion?
No, I think we have to go through them one by one.
It wasn't until I reread the minutes from the meeting, but this came up from Ed Leonard's presentation back in June, was it? Yeah, June 21st. The second paragraph of the overview says 225 dwelling units, and then would be what, the fourth paragraph says 243 dwelling units. And I know that's only 10%, but those numbers have shown up again in his PowerPoint, and I wonder, is it a historical thing? Maybe back in 2006, there were only 225, and now there's 243? Are they projecting build-out? Because there must be more build-out in that area than just 20 units. But anyway, I just saw the disparity given the numbers, and I remembered I had completely forgot to bring it up months ago.
But for the purpose of minutes, if he actually said it, even though it's inconsistent, we're stuck with it. But
Okay, I wanted to make sure that's what he said.
It's a very good question.
I think the 225 refers to the number of new units constructed since 1977.
No.
Okay. I'm not sure which.
No, it says the majority of the
Were
225
constructed.
units were constructed since 1977. But,
Oh,
It should be the majority of the dwelling units, 225. So the 225 is the number, the wording is not clear.
but it's still the total number of units in the,
well, that's simply.
and there were certainly many there before 1970. But anyway, I just,
Well, do you want to hold that one then? And just
Yeah, no,
with
I'm not-
the other two,
Yeah.
until we can clarify that?
it just,
Meant there were only
I think
18.
we have to go through them one by one.
and other than that, I'll second Steve's blanket endorsement
Well,
of
the
the.
blanket has
Let's-
just been revoked.
Let's change, yes, let's just change the
Okay,
motion.
Let's vote on the 62118 version.
I'll second
Moved,
that,
Who moves it? Who do you-
moved by Ron, seconded by Tom.
yeah.
No, I can't move it.
Oh, you weren't
Someone-
there?
I
Okay,
wasn't
fair
there.
enough.
He wasn't
That's why
there.
I'm going
Someone
one
who
by
was
one.
there,
Huh, yeah.
I'll move they be accepted as presented, if someone then will then back
Seconded.
me up.
okay. Okay. Are you moving the June 21st one, or all?
Yeah,
I just did the 21st
21st,
now.
okay. We got a
though.
motion, do we have a second?
Yes, right here.
Second. Moved and seconded for the June 21st. Further discussion?
No.
All in favor, signify by saying
Aye.
aye. Aye, opposed,
I
yes.
abstain.
Fine.
yeah. He wasn't.
Okay, give me a motion on the 7/19, July 19th. That was the one with the
Okay,
East Falmouth.
I'll move it, because I was there.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
I have to abstain because I have to leave early.
Abstain.
I have to leave early. 'cause of the-
As a complete,
It did for a long time.
ex post facto, I think we have to really appreciate the people that sat through that entire presentation that night. It was,
The East Falmouth one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were originally told they had half an hour. and-
Right.
And then it turned out.
oh, 10
Oh,
minutes?
10 minutes.
We can't even get wet in 10 minutes.
Well, I asked Brian about it, and he thought he had been given half an hour. So,
It went on.
but the audience paid attention.
Yes.
Well, it's right in their backyard, so they're.
It was supposed to be just a brief overview, and it was a whole dissertation.
Yeah.
So we won't be invited back.
No.
Cautiously.
All right, we'll hold the 8:15 version until clarification is received.
6:15.
No, the August 15th one.
Oh.
Isn't that the one that he's having an issue with?
No.
No, we've already approved the one that there was an issue with.
The-
So
Okay.
move on.
All
Right.
Okay, fine.
And those numbers aren't presented in these minutes, so I'm not raising, but I'm pretty
Okay.
sure he used it.
We'll track it down, because
Okay.
it's important.
And I'll move that they be accepted then from the August 15th.
Okay,
Okay, great. Okay.
okay. Meeting
Yep.
schedule for September? Okay. We're gonna-
Thank you, Ron.
We're going to get back into the 2 meetings a month routine. Summer is over, sailing season is winding down.
Well,
The next meeting would be the 6th,
yes.
where we actually, I think we would probably devote the 6th to the Oyster Pond IA Working Group's work, which has been going on in some detail for a while, and since we're all up to speed on Oyster Pond, we should get into the weeds a little more. So
Mhm.
that will be on that agenda.
At 3:30?
Yeah, let's go
If
back to 3:30. Is it-
I might not be able to make 3:30 if we kept it
What
in the
time?
morning. In the same time, it's
Mor-
9 o'clock. in the
Morning is better?
Well, it's only, I have company coming from us.
Okay.
so-
You're gonna have to choose between me and Ron then.
Oh.
So I can't make the
We
morning.
can't do mornings.
Okay, well,
Lunch.
let's leave it open,
Oh.
because George Hoyfelter may be able to attend this meeting, and we don't have a feedback from him if he needs a morning versus an
Well,
afternoon.
That's a good point.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, let's-
So it will be the 6th, but time to be determined.
Sounds good.
And the next one's the 20th.
The next one's the 20th, and the U.S. Geological Survey is going to give us a report on the data they've collected on Mara Vista. They're doing the before and after. We aren't quite to after yet, because not everybody's hooked up yet, but it's a very important study.
Time of day for that one?
Be 3:30. They've already confirmed for 3:30.
Does that work for Ron?
What, Yeah.
Well, that's
you know,
our
I think
standard
I
time.
only have the 6th maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
But,
All right, check it
yeah.
out.
That's Thursday,
As far as I know.
September
Thursday,
20th.
September 20th at 3:30.
Okay. Matt, do you have a motion for me?
Yes, motion to adjourn.
Wow.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. All in
Thank
favor,
you.
signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.
All right, thank you.
Had it ready for the last 10 minutes.
Well, I apologize.